All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us continue. So we are continuing this morning in Os Nun Hey in Tzidkas HaTzaddik. So the Rebbe introduced us last week to the incredibly profound and overwhelming yesod that there are two seats of knowledge. There's intellectual knowledge, there's emotional knowledge, and the chilek, the distinction between intellectual knowledge and emotional knowledge, is that I could possess intellectual knowledge and yet totally ignore it. Yet emotional knowledge, it is incredibly difficult and virtually impossible to truly ignore. So we spent about 2 shiurim last week. We're going to spend one more Me'eretz Hashem today, focusing on the very powerful story in Maseches Menachos. So remember again, the Rebbe quoted the story in Maseches Menachos with the individual who was a Talmid of Rabbi Chia, who was Nizhar B'tzitzis. He was incredibly medactic, incredibly meticulous with the mitzvah of tzitzis, and also happened to be an exceptionally immoral individual. He's right about to go ahead and sin with his very expensive harlot, and what happens? The tzitzis smack him in the face. He sits down, he does tshuva. To make a long story short, we saw in the Gemara also, the harlot herself is so taken by him that she decides to track him down, finds his base medrash, ultimately converts, and marries him. So says Reb HaTzaddik. I don't remember exactly where we left off, so we'll pick off on page Kuf Lamed Gimel. On page Kuf Lamed Gimel, in the Be'orei Chasidus, the left-hand paragraph. So just actually the last 2 lines of the right-hand paragraph. Umusupar sham shezachar es chumras ha'isr al yidei shirah ha'tzitzis. V'nidmelo ka'arba edim, umachmos ze nimna libasof min ha'avera. Did I forget?
Maybe.
I did.
I'll do it.
Okay. I didn't change anything. Okay. So let's see. So he writes over here that the 4 tzitzis end up smacking him in the face. And remember again, as a result of that, he goes ahead and he doesn't sin. Right? He smacks him in the face. They become like 4 witnesses, and he doesn't sin. So the HaTzaddik says, what's the pshat? What's the pshat? V'ish lahavin. The imagery is very profound. The tzitzis smack him in the face, therefore he doesn't sin. So what's the pshat that the smacking in the face of the tzitzis causes him not to sin? So it says Rabbi V'ish lahavin. Harisham be'isr hahu haya mezid. Ve'odea bebeirur es chumras ha'isr. So we'll say, it's not the pshat that when the tzitzis smacked him in the face, he's like, oh, I didn't realize that our rayos are asr, right? I had no idea that immorality was problematic, and now the tzitzis smacked me in the face, and now I realize immorality is problematic. In other words, what happened over here when the tzitzis hit him? He says, Shari haya adam gadol umimnei yeshivas shabichir. Remember again, how does the Gemara introduce this individual? The Gemara introduces him as someone who was one of the major talmidim in the yeshiva of Rabbi Chia. Right, so it's not the pshat that he lacked knowledge. Sometimes a person commits an avera because they don't know. It happens, right? I didn't know the halacha, or I didn't know this, or I was unaware of this. That wasn't the case over here. This person wasn't suffering from a lack of knowledge. So what is it that happened? Ve'im kain yesh lahavin ezi odia hischad shalo az beriyas hatzitzis sho'ia lemono min hachet. So we'll say there was no new epiphany, right? There was no new piece of information, no new piece of knowledge that suddenly crept into his mind that prevented him from sinning. Rather, what happened? Rak muchach mizeh sha'amdu hatzitzis negdo bazesh nischadish lo ayideyem regesh hazechira. So we'll say what happened over here was not the introduction of an intellectual thought, but ultimately, again, the introduction of a regesh, the introduction of a feeling. Something changed emotionally. Something changed in his feelings. This individual is unnamed Talmud, always possessed the intellectual knowledge. That was never the issue. But in that moment when he was ready to sin with this woman, although he possessed the intellectual knowledge, he lacked the emotional knowledge. And when the tzitzis came along and smacked him in the face, what the tzitzis did was reintroduce the emotional knowledge. It took that which he knew intellectually and infused it into him emotionally. In that moment, v'lo zchira chadasha, rak be'inyon ze shezchira avra min yedias hamoach v'nichnesa gam lahargashas halev. We'll say that phrase is so profound. What happened with the tzitzis is that ultimately, again, the understanding or his memory transferred from an intellectual awareness to an emotional awareness. And the moment that ultimately, again, he became emotionally aware of what he was about to do. Well, so you remember the imagery from the Gemara. What did he do when the tzitzis smacked him in the face? He sat down on the ground. He had that moment of, what am I doing? What am I doing? How did I let myself come to this point? How am I about to engage in this action? What am I doing to my life? What am I doing to myself? Why am I not more careful with the decisions that I'm making? So amazingly enough, says HaTzaddik, there was no new epiphany over here. I thought arayas were mutter. Now I realize that they're usser. There was no new awareness of, I thought this woman is my basher. No, I realize she's a zona. No, it's like there's no new intellectual epiphany over here. The intellectual knowledge was there the whole time. But as HaTzaddik said, you could ignore what you know intellectually. You could ignore intellectual knowledge. You could choose to act outside of intellectual knowledge. But when the tzitzis came along and smacked him in the face, it created an emotional awareness. An emotional awareness, posits HaTzaddik, is something you cannot ignore. Turn the page, Kof Lamed Daled. The Rebbe goes on, V'chein Amra Kadmonim, and he quotes over here again the earlier commentaries, Tanat Rabbi Eliyahu and others, Telachin Nismach Tzivoy Parshas Tzitzis. This is actually very interesting. This Sipor Shalom HaKoshesh Eitzim Yom Shabbos. So remember again, the Torah tells the story of the Klal Yisrael Vayimse'eo Ish Mekoshesh Eitzim B'Yom HaShabbos. Klal Yisrael found the guy. Mekoshesh Eitzim literally means either chopping down wood or gathering wood. The point is, he was being mechalal Shabbos publicly. Right? He was publicly violating Shabbos. So the Torah relates that Tzaddik relates that right after the story of the Mekoshesh, the Torah introduces the parsha of Tzitzis. Mitzvah of Tzitzis. Why? The Sivram Shalom Mekoshesh, Shamekoshesh Hegia La'aver Zusha Chol Shabbos, Rak Mipnei Shebeshabbos Lo Hayu Lo Hatfilin Barosho Bizro. So we'll say, before we go on, what Tzaddik is introducing over here is something quite interesting. Because the $1 million question is, even if we accept, of course we accept, I accept the premise that there's intellectual knowledge and there's emotional knowledge. I accept the premise that I could ignore intellectual knowledge and act outside of it, but yet I can't really ignore emotional knowledge. I accept the fact that there are many things that I know intellectually, but for whatever the reason, I have not internalized them emotionally. If that's the case, then the $1 million question becomes, how do you transform intellectual knowledge into emotional knowledge? How do you do that? To which Reb Tzaddik says, we'll say that's the point of the story. How do you do that? Mitzvos. Mitzvos have the ability to transform intellectual knowledge into emotional awareness. That's the role of a mitzvah. That's why this individual, again, and you're going to see it's not even just any mitzvos, it's what Reb Tzaddik will call, or what we'll call, mitzvos tmidios. The constant mitzvos. The mitzvos that I constantly surround myself, those are the things that have the ability to go ahead and transform intellectual awareness into emotional awareness. It was the tzitzis, specifically again getting smacked in the face by the tzitzis, that transformed this unnamed individual's intellectual awareness into emotional awareness. So Reb Tzaddik says that's why, again we'll at least begin this part, Reb Tzaddik says that's why the parsha of tzitzis is mentioned right after the episode with the Mekoshesh. The Mekoshesh was Mechalel Shabbos. And Mechalel Shabbos violated Shabbos publicly. Says Reb Tzaddik, how could that have occurred? And the answer is, it occurred because on Shabbos, what do you lack? I lack tefillin. What do tefillin do for me? Tefillin are an os. Tefillin are a reminder of the unique covenantal relationship that I enjoy with the Ribono Shel Olam. And on Shabbos, when I'm not wearing my tefillin, I run the risk of just having intellectual knowledge and not having emotional knowledge. Rabbi HaTzaddik says, "Shamakoshi shigia la'avera zu shechol Shabbos rak mipnei she'b'Shabbos lo hayu lo atfilin barosho Yisrael." Shabbos, I don't have my tefillin. So therefore, this is incredible, by the way. Remember, everything in Tzidkas HaTzaddik, it builds on each other. Remember, again, Rabbi HaTzaddik goes with the idea that people at their essence are good. People at their essence are good, and when a Jew commits an Aveira, that's not reflective of an inner corruption. That's not reflective of some type of inner negativity. That's reflective of something else going on in my life. So if at my core I'm good, how does the Mekoshish, how is he Mechal Shabbos? How does that happen? So HaTzaddik says, because he forgot his emotional knowledge. He became emotionally unaware. Well, why did he become emotionally unaware on a Shabbos? Oh, because there's a lack of a consistent covenantal mitzvah on Shabbos. There's no tefillin on Shabbos, right? Tefillin is that mitzvah that I do each and every day that reminds me of my connection. And it's the mitzvah that transforms intellectual knowledge into emotional knowledge. Therefore, what happens in the aftermath of the Makoshesh? HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us the mitzvah of tzitzis. Why the mitzvah of tzitzis? Why the mitzvah of tzitzis? Because it's 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And the consistency of that mitzvah, that's surrounding myself with that mitzvah, is what has the ability to transform the intellectual knowledge into emotional knowledge. Right? So we'll have to stop over here. We're going to pick up, we're going to spend one more day in Mir Hashem on this oath tomorrow and finish out the concept of the Rebbe.